The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
You've got to sit on your hands while...
Do you?
Yeah. Well, actually, no, it didn't happen at mine, but some people have told me that they were asked to sit on their hands while the probe went up their nose, and
Okay.
Our audience should be sitting on their hands while political commentary and analysis is just shoved deep into their brain by the swab of Gone By Lunchtime.
Kia ora tātou, this is Gone By Lunchtime. It is July the 28th, middle of the morning, 10-something, relatively calm waters of New Zealand politics. My name is Toby Manhire, I'm the editor of The Spin-Off. With me, Annabelle who's the executive producer of The Hui.
Kia ora and happy birthday to my son Moke, who is 19 today.
Happy birthday, Moke. Ben Thomas is also with us. Welcome, Ben. You are, what are you? A freelance public relations consultant.
Radio New Zealand have started calling me an independent public relations consultant.
Oh, yes.
In order to make clear
Yes.
that I don't work for the National Party, my former colleague Matthew Hooton, or any of the other bogey men.
Are
of
you
their
working
listenership.
for any political parties in this election?
I'm not working for any political parties.
You
in this
did do a
election.
little bit of work in one of the former elections for the ACT Party.
2017. what a
Since you
time.
stopped working for them, they seem to have become popular.
They've just gone from strength to strength.
So anyway, Ben's available for all of your local mum and dad PR consultancy work. A big shout out to Flick Electric, who sponsor this podcast, and also a word for Spin-Off members, which is what enables the good ship Spin-Off to stay afloat through the stormy waters of the crisis in journalism. What are we going to talk about today? We'll start with the subject on everyone's lips, which is the big poll that came out on Sunday evening, Newshub. It was described by the political editor Tova O'Brien as throwing a bazooka into the politics.
Do you throw a bazooka or shoot a bazooka?
Well, she said throw a bazooka, which is
Can you
interesting.
shoot a grenade?
I think it's different because it's like throwing a bazooka in, and then New Zealand politics like, who wants to pick up the bazooka and use it? You know,
Yes.
I don't think it's that. I think bazookas are just heavy, and by throwing it, you're really showing that things are out of control.
Not even loaded.
You know,
Just-
like I mean, any person who defects to the Middle East to join a terrorist organization can hold a bazooka, but you know, if you're the kind of guy who's like throwing a bazooka at people, you know, you mean business.
Yeah.
That's
Throwing it at your enemies and daring them to pick it up and shoot you with it.
Inked in twink on aforesaid bazooka were the numbers 60.9% for the Labour Party, 25.1% for the National Party, 5.7% for the Green Party, 2.0% for New Zealand First Party, and the ACT Party, now that they are unshackled from the PR advice from Ben Thomas, at 3.3%, and probably popular with the bazooka-loving ordinary New Zealanders.
this is essentially a metaphor for all of my exes.
Ben, you wrote about this poll for the Spin-Off almost as soon as it came out on Sunday evening. What's your read on this? I mean, it is. The hyperbole is real, isn't it? It's a pretty extraordinary, devastating result for National.
Yeah, it's the second time that Labour has gone over 60% in this term in that Newshub poll. Actually, the first time was Colmar Brunton. So So it's gone over 60% in 2 polls, which is extraordinarily high. That has happened before under MMP. I think. No,
Twice, I think. There was Bolger did it once, and maybe Clark once. I don't think Key ever got over 60, did he?
But and where this is different from other collapses by opposition parties, or major opposition parties. So we're talking about Labour under Andrew Little before Jacinda Ardern came on board. We're talking Bill English in the 2002 election. In those cases, the support from the large opposition party streamed off into minor parties. So you had very good election results for New Zealand First, for ACT, for the Greens. And in 2014, New Zealand First and the Greens were both polling in the double digits while Labour was in chaos. Here, it's all gone to the governing party. The gap between Labour plus the Greens and, if you were being generous, New Zealand First versus National plus ACT is just enormous. And what's happened is that those wavering, soft sort of centre voters going actually quite deep into National Party territory are now with the government. Won over presumably by the strong pandemic response, slightly shaken by the calamity within National's own ranks over the past few weeks. I think the caveat is, National have come out quite strongly saying it's a rogue poll, which I think we can discount. In order for it to be a statistical error, you're talking very, 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 very infinitesimal chances that a random result could throw up something that was that wrong compared to where they're sort of trying to portray themselves at. But a poll is a snapshot in time, and this poll was taken at the point at which Judith Collins had just taken over, which was also the point at which the National Party leader had essentially disappeared. We still haven't heard anything from Todd Muller. He had only been in the job for 2 months. There was a raft of senior departures, Nikki Kay and Amy Adams. There was the Andrew Falloon sexting, dirty pictures, whatever scandal, which, doesn't portray you in a good light. All the while, National trying to run this argument about a strong team. And it was before, which we'll get onto soon, Iain Lees-Galloway was sacked as a minister. So it was basically the worst possible window. I
don't think it was entirely. I changed that in your piece because pretty much. Yeah. I mean, like towards the end. Do you and Annabelle very swiftly Collins, and then unusually a press release from Gerry Brownlee, who's both deputy leader and overseeing the National Party campaign, came out with a press release saying this is a rogue poll. Do you think that carries any weight, or does it smell of desperation? And what do you make of these numbers in terms of the extent to which they reflect either confidence in Jacinda Ardern and Labour versus what Ben called the calamity in National?
I think what it reflects is a perfect storm of a really high-performing Prime Minister and a very poorly performing opposition happening at the same time, which is why the results seem so extreme. While I do realise that rogue polls are a thing, I don't believe that this is one. And even if you adjusted it by 10 points, it'd still show that National's in dire straits. I think being so quick to come out and dismiss it as a rogue poll isn't necessarily a great strategy, because I think it shows defensiveness, a lack of self-awareness, and, the problem with polls like this is, regardless of how correct they are, they create a narrative, and the narrative is that, National's sliding more and more down the dirty gulch and Labour's streets ahead. So it creates a dynamic where National's always having to defend, justify, and that in itself is, just as damaging as if we were able to confirm 100% the absolute accuracy of the poll.
And that's one of the reasons that Judith Collins has made it clear that she will share the internal polling of the National Party with her caucus today being Tuesday. My suggestion, if you're listening immediately, Judith Collins, is that you send all the polling data to the MPs individually and just change 1 decimal point in one of the parties for each of the members, and then when Tova publishes it, you'll be able to see who's the leaker.
National have been pretty adamant that their internal polling does have them higher than 25%. They're left in an invidious position. Whenever you get a poll result that's this bad, your options are very limited, right? You can either tell the truth and say, this is terrible, but as Annabelle said, these things do have their own momentum. Colmar Brunton is either just finished polling or is currently polling for its poll.
Midweek is the talk, yeah.
And so that means that the disastrous result for National is in the minds of people who are being polled by Colmar Brunton. So these things do have a knock-on effect. So you can either concede, our polling sucks, but nobody would.
But we're working hard to win back the confidence of our supporters.
But what people usually go with is a variant on, it was a rogue poll, our internal polling is higher, at which point the internal polling gets leaked and it generally gets shown to be like 2% higher or something.
What we're hearing on the ground?
Yeah, and that's not what I'm hearing in the community. That's when I'm going door knocking at university statisticians' houses, and when I
lie in bed at night staring at the ceiling and the mold creeping in from the corners and speak to my spouse plaintively, what I'm hearing is that my party is fine.
Yeah, and and you basically just have to suck up a day or two of looking like a bit of an idiot and then just carry on as best you can.
It speaks to perhaps the infrequency of political polling in New Zealand, but also the frequency of turnover in the national leadership, that we didn't get a Newshub read poll at all for the leadership of Mullet, did we?
For Mullet, no. Maybe he was really good.
Could have been.
We'll never know.
My other thought about this is that in a poll, a Colmar poll about the proximity from the 2017 is almost exactly the same proximity from 2017 election as this one is from the 2020 election. Labour hit 24%. This one, National, hit 25%, struggling. And then what happened is there was a swift Hail Mary move to replace the leader with the deputy. And so I'm wondering whether, Annabelle, you think Gerry Brownlee could be the...
He is the leader New Zealand
could be the surge,
has
the
been
Gerry
searching
surge.
for. I think that's highly likely.
I mean, the thing is, the leader should reflect the mood of the nation after lockdown, trapped in here, seeing all these highfalutin, think they're better than us, overseas New Zealanders wanting to come back for free. Maybe the country is getting a bit grouchy, a bit grumpy, a bit of a short fuse. Yeah. Maybe Gerry is the man for the times.
Relentlessly positive, fuck that. What about relentlessly just a bit pissed off with everything? Just a bit fucked off, actually.
Just a little bit annoyed to be here. a little done with this shit which we've been doing for decades. But I mean, what that is an interesting thing though, because Colmar Brunton did poll during the Mullet era. The Mullet epoch. And of course, National was on 38% there, so quite a comeback.
Yeah.
And now, so if you look at the drop from 38% to 25%, even more catastrophic.
Different polls, different methodologies.
Different polls, different
Clearly
methodologies.
a rogue poll.
Which one?
I don't know. The rogue poll is the one you don't like. I think it should be.
But I think the serious point that it makes is that once you start getting down to 25% for National and 61% for Labour, you are talking about support that is incredibly soft. So it's not as if I did a presentation at the Northern Club with Neil Jones, who was talking about Labour's polling, when they were at about sort of 50% or 52% or whatever. And he was saying, the at-risk voters have gone from being teachers and nurses to being middle managers and finance company employees. Well, at 60%, the at-risk Labour voters are tax criminals, the Sensible Sentencing Trust, and investment bank executives. These are not people who are core Labour voters. And you can see, because that Colmar-Brunton poll, the 38% one for National, was taken during that, border shambles where the two women had zorbed to Wellington. And you can see that there is a lot of vote right now, probably anything above 45% for Labour, is basically just sort of a free radical floating in space, sloshing around based on the news headlines of the day. So, that's the quote-unquote good news for National, is that, voters that it should be able to rely on are currently just sort of floating in space and up for grabs depending on who's looking better or what scandal is in the news.
Are they? I mean, there are two other kind of, I think, interesting data points in this poll, even if we accept that it's sort of on the, about as good as Labour might have hoped for. And one which I think is very serious and kind of seals it, arguably, is that the question that was asked was, which party do you most trust to run the economy from now on through and after COVID? That's an economy question. And 62.3% Labour under Jacinda Ardern, 26.5% National under Judith Collins. And that's the kind of backbone of the National brand, isn't it? Like, if fully almost 2/3 of people feel that the Labour Party is the party that holds the economic solutions to this crisis, then you kind of wonder where National can go with this.
Again, I think that's a reflection of the culture shift in National, which used to be the party of the New Zealand squirearchy. And as we've seen that the culture of National, the demographic of National has been replaced, we've seen a number of poorly performing, undisciplined MPs. So I think that is really a vote of no confidence in in National as it appears today. I don't even know if that's necessarily a vote of confidence in Labour. I think that's a punishment of National for poor performing MPs.
It's also got to be, don't you think, serious mark of commendation for the handling of the COVID crisis. And this is why I feel like clearly the shambles that we've seen in the National Party is a big deal and feeds into this. But at the same time, part of the reason that they're in that situation is because the message that people have been sending in a series of polls, including those that we've run for the spin-off about with Sticky Beak, just show people think that the right decisions have been made. They look out at the rest of the world. They look at Victoria, they look at the USA, they look at the UK, and they just go, look, things aren't perfect. And yep, no doubt we've got quite a lot of steroids in our system with the wage subsidy and other measures. But would you swap? And it's hard to imagine a more uphill battle than to be the political opposition to that. Having said all that, there's one other part of the poll that I think maybe offers a small amount of at least hope for Judith Collins, which is to say that you can't pin all of that overall result on Judith Collins. National are at 25%, but still 39.5% of respondents, 40% of people think Collins is performing well.
That's why I think that it's about a vote of no confidence in National itself rather than Collins.
Right. I don't think any of it is Judith Collins' fault. I think, all of you could say there's a nexus between Muller's leadership ending, Collins taking over, the departures of Adams, Kay, but the Falloon thing is, its own event, kind of out of the blue. And, Collins didn't cause that. She didn't topple Muller. There was no, she was literally handed the hospital pass. In terms of the economy, or the economic handling, I think that's right. it is hard to sort of point at Labour and say, that they've mishandled it in any way. And in terms of steroids in the economy, sure, we've seen economists last week saying that, the wage subsidy is delaying the inevitable, that there's a bit of a sense that the economy, which is holding up, really well right now, unemployment hasn't hit sort of...
Doing better than
low 7%, right? But there's a feeling from economists that perhaps it's a bit like Wile E. Coyote kind of running on air, before he looks down. At the same time, what is an economy? An economy is just people spending money. Confidence doesn't really matter where the confidence comes from. If people are spending money, there's velocity of circulation. People are paying other people to do things and to make things. That's an economy that's running well. So we can't. And in terms of the debt, which was National's, one of their big planks of attack. Well, the government just shelved, $14 billion of that $20 billion that was, allowed to be spent on the COVID response. So they've actually cut off a lot of that criticism as well. So there aren't that many ways through for National right now. They had that popular announcement about charging returnees for quarantine, which, Labour is doing anyway. So Labour are doing that very... John Key-esque kind of strategy of
triangulation.
Yeah, of immediately sort of co-opting and absorbing any policy that the opposition runs that looks popular. And you see it, Judith Collins has been in the news talking about the grant of refugee status to the author, supported by the Greens. Now, That's not a confident position to be taking going into an election campaign, to be talking about one immigration.
Yeah, going on Magic Talk and talking about Barry's Bucciati definitely seems like a kind of reeks of desperation to me.
Hello there, Simon Pound here from another spin-off podcast with a little bit of cross-promo for you. If you might be into the stories of Aotearoa's most interesting entrepreneurs and innovators, you might like to check out Business is Boring, the podcast I host that reckons it's anything but. Recent episodes have included great guests like Tim Brown from Allbirds, Kiri Nathan from her own label, and Brianne West with the amazing story of Ethi. If that sounds like a bit of you, it's available through the spin-off or wherever you find your favourite podcasts.
Let's talk, Annabelle, about something that happened in the second half of last week after the Andrew Falloon situation. Jacinda Ardern on, I think it was Thursday morning, I may stand corrected, called a kind of urgent press conference at the Beehive Theaterette where she announced that she had dismissed Iain Lees-Galloway. That followed earlier in the morning Judith Collins appearing on the AM show on 3, where she was asked, just so happens she was asked by Duncan Garner whether or not she'd heard anything about the Labour Party.
What a moonshot question.
It sure was,
amazing.
Right? Sometimes in this business, ladies and gentlemen, you just feel it. And you just feel a question. And it comes to you as if out of the very earth itself. Iain Lees-Galloway was dismissed over in a relationship which went for about a year, I think. It was now concluded with someone who had worked in an agency which came under the purview of his workplace relations portfolio, and Ardern, as she explained it wasn't appropriate for the Minister of Workplace Relations. He lost all his ministerial warrants and is standing down at the election. There was also, the way it played out, there was a sort of equivalence drawn between the Falloon situation, which involved unsolicited pornographic images being sent to a number of women, including one teenager, and this consensual affair, details of which we don't know. What did you make of all that? Do you think that Ardern was left with any choice in that situation?
Well, last week I came here and talked about what a great job I thought both Judith Collins and Jacinda had done in the handling of the Falloon furore. And this week I feel absolutely the opposite about how both of them handled the Iain Lees-Galloway issue. And as Ben rightly pointed out on Twitter, it's difficult to commentate on a story like this because in a couple of hours' time, what you may have said may make you look like a total asshole as more information comes to hand. But if we are to accept what we know at the moment, which is that there wasn't actually a complaint laid with Judith Collins' office, that in fact she received a tip-off from a third party, not from the woman who he allegedly had an affair with, not from his wife, Ardern, responds by turning around and sacking him. I just think it's one of the most bizarre knee-jerk reactions to, a private matter that I've ever seen in Parliament. And for her to call a press conference about it just seemed like a complete overreaction. And I think John Rogan's opinion piece on it and Heather Duplessis-Allen's piece about Jacinda being snookered by Judith are right on the money. And the justification that it's because he's the Minister for Employment Relations seemed a bizarre reason too. And I mean, if certain portfolios are going to have caveats on them, is that the right word?
Caveat,
caveat.
A higher level of expectation would be another way to put it,
then they should be clearly. Then the public should know that, so that we know what to expect. Like if
the Minister of ACC can't have loose cords in their office.
That's right.
Or just no power tools at all.
Slippery surfaces.
Exactly.
It's. I mean, it does. I hadn't heard this rumour. Apparently, everyone had about Iain Lees-Galloway. But God knows, every time you go to Wellington, you hear another story. I mean, some of them are true. Some of them are no doubt made up. Like there are various political rumours that one hears lately that are founded on absolute bullshit, and
that's right.
They circulate very quickly. But there is a difficult area there, isn't there, Ben? You've been around that. You've spent more time in that precinct than we have, and what are the rules now? Have the rules changed? Is it a question of because maybe this is it. Maybe there is. You need to privately declare to your political boss if you have a workplace, if you have a relationship with someone, and maybe that's simple as that. I don't know.
So I think the first and fundamental point is that MPs having sex is disgusting and should not happen.
Yeah. I think we can all agree on that.
Now, once we've worked past that first principle, I don't think that it was out of order for Judith Collins to raise it, and I don't think it was out of order for the Prime Minister to sack Lees-Galloway.
Why is it not out of order for her to raise if someone's having an affair?
Well, I wasn't intending to expand on it. No, I was going to get onto that. The reason is that I know in these post Me Too times, it almost seems quaint, the idea that you would discipline somebody.
It wasn't a Me Too issue, Ben.
No,
she wasn't.
Can
it
you
wasn't
just
the
let me
partner.
finish?
It wasn't the woman that was complaining. It was some office gossip.
Yeah, if you had listened to the second bit of the sentence, we could have.
Go on then.
So in the post Me Too environment, it almost seems quaint to sack somebody for a consensual affair where there is no sort of hint that either of the parties in it was victimised, right? But at the same time, and I also don't buy this argument that there was a power imbalance, that it's impossible for somebody to give informed consent or genuine consent where, a Minister of the Crown is involved because they're so lofty and Olympian, right? Where it is an issue, if a minister is boning somebody in their agency that they have responsibility for, is that, like any workplace, it can create issues within the organisation. Especially, and it's exacerbated if it's a secret affair. And these are totally hypothetical questions, or examples. But say the person wants some leave so that they can rendezvous with the minister, and they ask their chief executive if they can have time off, and the chief executive knows what's going on, but they can't say anything, and then they're put in a difficult position. Do I refuse the leave? Do I? And so there does become an issue of equal treatment. That's why these relationships in professional organisations have to be declared and managed in a lot of cases. And in some firms, they're just outright not allowed. And if that sort of issue for the culture or for the organisation can create a problem, I think in this kind of case, it certainly can. This person was working in Galloway's office at some point. They were working in an agency that was under his responsibility as the minister. So particularly the furtiveness around it, can cause real problems. Consent is obviously necessary, but it's not sufficient to say that a relationship will always be appropriate in a workplace. And moving on, so I think that's why it was totally within the Prime Minister's bounds to sack Galloway for that. With Judith Collins and how she introduced it into the discourse, I don't think it was best practice. I think it would have actually been entirely fine for her to ask about it at question time, or to advance it.
It's not just that it wasn't best practice. It looked as though it was a kind of a tribute act to the dirty politics playbook.
How is it? No, it's not dirty. No, it is not dirty politics if an opposition leader raises an issue about the conduct of a minister. That's just normal politics. That's holding a government.
Feeds it out in the media, so there wasn't any opportunity really given. I mean, that's the snookering question, right? And the other thing, and I'm not. This is not what you're saying. I accept that, but the equivalence, I think, with the Falloon situation is that in that case, the tip-off, if you like, came from the parents of one of the victims. And that was then fed through the channels, which I think is materially different to this mysterious tip-off, which, again, we don't know where it came from, but there is no suggestion that it involved any victim or any whistleblowing per se, so much as, scuttlebutt. We don't know.
Also, can you never use the word boning in this context again? It's deeply disturbing.
Unfortunately, no.
Traumatised.
No, we have to come to grips with the reality of what's going down in Wellington. And unfortunately, it is boning.
I'd like to apologise to everybody for the use of the word. Let's move on, as Helen Clark would say, and talk about something much more wholesome, which is the Green Party and their their campaign launch. On Saturday morning. The 52 pages of their sort of vision document. It's kind of interesting to think that before the last election, of course, the big document was the budget responsibility rules that were put out by the Greens and the Labour Party in tandem. Of course, they don't have one of those anymore because one of the parts of it was that if catastrophe strikes, then they tear it up. And there's been no talk about it at all since. But this document is intended as a kind of policy, a sort of a rudder, I guess, and it's to help them with any post-election negotiations they get into, and then if are they to make it back into government, it will be a touchstone for them, I think. Did you catch any of that? Did it? The Greens, you were away you were having a lovely weekend away, weren't you, Annabelle? Which is why you weren't glued to the live stream of the Greens launch. How about you, Ben? Were you watching closely?
Fortunately, I'm very lonely, and so I have been keeping a real-time eye on developments in the campaign. The manifesto, which is the first comprehensive, sort of election manifesto that the Greens have produced. So in the past, they've, just like other parties, they've had these kind of sprawling collections of remits held together in, scrolls and ring binders of all the sort of, notions that their members have passed over time. This is the first time they've come out with, a comprehensive manifesto for the election on each policy issue. And that's a signal that they've done a bit of learning from New Zealand First. In the past, what the Greens have done is they've had a couple of memorandum of understanding in the past with governments, and they had the confidence and supply agreement this time. And the Greens have largely been happy to do their negotiation post-election, get 5 or 6 or 20 in this case of varying specificity promises from the government, and then in exchange they just sort of go with the government's program. It's always been a Labour government. Well, actually, no, sorry, they did sign an MOU with the key government as well, in which they didn't go along with. They just got their negotiated policies. And this is an indication that, you know, they are looking to be in government with Labour, without New Zealand First on the current dismal sort of 2% polling, and they want to play a part in each decision that is made, as the government goes through its 3-year term, rather than just being happy with their, negotiated list in the month after the election. So that's a sort of positive development for Green supporters in terms of showing a bit more sort of stiffening of the spine. There is a perception, I think, not least amongst their members, that the Greens have been kind of a soft touch for Labour, that they get kind of pushed around by Ardern and most obviously by New Zealand First. New Zealand First call the shots on which policies go through. They're the handbrake. The Greens are just sort of, the
CRC.
The supportive best friend that you can always retreat to after your prom date's ditched you.
No, I need a metaphor. If the handbrake is the New Zealand First to the handbrake, then what are the Greens in terms of, they like air in the tires, or one of those sort of things buttons that you push that goes in the car?
I think the Greens are just the Greens are the people who drive Labour around. The Greens are the people that Ardern can just call up and go, "Hey, could you give me a lift?"
The electric. Oh yeah, okay.
They're the hybrid car.
Yeah, we'll work on this.
Now,
we'll work on this, listeners.
The problem for the Greens here is that on the current polling, Labour won't need them at all.
Yeah,
just as they've found their mojo.
I mean, they've been very polite. And I think, I'm surprised by this, and I've talked to a few people who used to be involved in the Green Party, and they're surprised, sort of frustrated by, compared to previous Green parties, they've been reasonably, with some exceptions, reasonably polite. Like, for example, the deal that was signed between the Labour and the Green Party included a pledge, and this is a quote, to overhaul the welfare system, which manifestly has not happened. Yeah. And if you had something that was as high priority in the New Zealand First deal with the Labour Party, by God, you would have heard about it.
Overhaul subsidies for rich horse breeders.
Right, yes, that's right. Or something.
Overhaul
right
shadowy relationships with Russia.
And they've been kind of, there's clearly a nervousness that came out of what happened last time round. 5 or 6%, steady as she goes. And I guess the hope for the Greens, Annabelle, is that the people in the Labour Party who err towards the left side will now look at a poll that says 60% and go, okay, I can safely move my vote to the Green Party.
I totally agree.
And push it in that direction. Do you think that'll happen?
Yeah, I do think that'll happen. And I hear what you said last week, Ben, about how you thought that Jacinda Ardern's international popularity would bleed support from the Greens. But I actually think that, the far left will see how well Labour is polling and feel, like you said, Toby, that they can safely deposit their vote with the Greens and not risk bringing in a national coalition. I think it's an interesting point, that one about overhauling the welfare system. And I think that's probably part of the Greens' overall problem, is that for understandable reasons, they've kind of moved away from the Jeanette Fitzsimmons brand of green politics, which was very much about local conservation efforts, and they've moved more and more into social justice, issues around, inequity and how we treat our beneficiaries and all of that stuff. And I think as a result, they have somewhat narrowed their supporter base, and that, I guess the blue-green vote. And I think although, we hear talk about climate change and those sort of big global issues, discussions around things like hectored dolphin and conservation projects, all of that sort of stuff has sort of been lost in that conversation, and that's an important part of the green DNA and probably something that they need to tap back into.
One other disadvantage they have is that they were probably a bit ahead of their time. So, once the Zero Carbon Act was passed, well, all parties locked that in as part of their brand. So it makes it harder then for the Greens to sort of say, well, we are doing something about climate change. Yeah, they passed the bill or the act, which all the other parties came on board for. And you see it with the environment as well. So, for instance, the Greens, one of their big announcements last week was their climate change policy, where they were talking about, replacing all of the industrial boilers in New Zealand, which use a lot of coal, with electrical boilers. And then over the weekend, Megan Woods, the Minister of Energy, announced $70 million to electrify industrial boilers in the South Island, as one of the consequences of Tiwai closing. So, they do find themselves, just as the wildlife of the earth, the animals that live in wild places find themselves increasingly displaced by urbanisation and the creep of humanity, so the Greens find themselves displaced from their ordinary kind of environmental policy areas by this Labour government.
There was also a hint, I think, in the weekend in some interviews, Marama Davidson in particular was pointing at issues of trust, which does seem like some territory that they can claim when you consider that just about the three biggest parties in Parliament are all either under investigation or being charged or linked to serious fraud office investigations relating to donations. There are all sorts of questions about behaviour as well, some of which we've covered. And the Greens have, they're living up to their sort of goody two shoes reputation. But that's something, isn't it? That they can genuinely hold their heads up high from that point of view.
As dirty as it gets in the Greens is like Rose Matawhio and Golriz having that Twitter spat over Guy Williams.
The Auckland comedy scene.
Girl fight.
There's also been a little bit of spiky action with James Shaw having a go at Winston Peters, in his sort of relatively polite fashion, and that brings me neatly to Winston Peters, who in this poll that we're talking about 2%. I mean, 2%. It's one of the cliches of New Zealand recent politics that New Zealand first outperform their polls, that they campaign well, that there's stuff that happens off the radar, but we've seen in the last week Winston Peters use parliamentary privilege to kind of, what did he do? Throw a bazooka into a long-running spat, which has ended up being through court and out of court, relating to the leak of his superannuation details in the lead up to the last election. This time, he named Rachel Morton and David Seymour and John Bishop, Chris Bishop's father, and just this kind of it was a bit like, what's that meme with the guy with the wall behind him and all the
it was very Illuminati,
just
this incredible kind of serious fraud office wiring diagram of Panama Papers style dotted lines between all of these very disparate, unconnected people.
It's getting to the point that if you haven't yet been named by Winston Peters as somehow involved in the terrible criminal enterprise of leaking his super details, you're no one at all.
I mean, look, he was ordered to pay $320,000 court costs for his last case in which he alleged about a dozen people were involved in leaking his super details. Why not have another go? Why, I get the feeling that he only just discovered that Rachel Morden and David Seymour used to be in a relationship.
Rachel Morden used to be the press secretary for Paula Bennett at the time, and she went on to be Simon Bridges' press secretary, and now is somebody who's just a citizen. And so, it's quite a big thing to be named under privilege like that, and she was very clear in her denying that she had anything to do with it at all, as was David Seymour. But parliamentary privilege is quite a sacred thing, and you wonder whether or not it's being used for sort of naked attention-seeking purposes. Bells?
Well, as a journalist, I believe in the, for want of a better word, like the tapu nature of protecting your sources, which is, our right as journalists. And sometimes you receive information and you run a story and you think it's in the public interest, but in retrospect, the public interest value is questionable. But nonetheless, you still have the right to protect your sources who brought you that story. And if I am to believe in it, then I also have to respect that it is a politician's right to use parliamentary privilege. Whether or not it's in the public interest, like journalism, is sometimes questionable. But I think that he has the right to do it, and there's a path of recourse that other people are able to take. So there's nothing to prevent David Seymour from referring him to the Privileges Committee, or Chris Bishop for that matter. So if the people he named are innocent of the allegations, that's a real shame, and I would imagine that David Seymour will be trying to push that into the Privileges Committee to question it. But having said that, someone still leaked Winston Peters' private information, and he has a right to know who that is, and whether or not that story was in the public interest, in my opinion, is highly questionable. Well, to me, it appeared to just be a political smear campaign.
The mother of all scandals, as it was famously described at the
mother
time.
of all bazookas.
The mother of all bazookas. One of the interesting things about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the suggestion seems to be that the people who ran the story may not even know from whom it came, which I think is an interesting journalistic question, which has no simple answer. But given it came from an anonymous call, and then I'm not sure about the bit after that, to be honest with you. But as a journalist, one of the things that you take into consideration when applying the public interest test is from whom the information came and whose agenda is being served, and it is
interrogating the motives of your source.
Yes, and if we think about the case of the individuals who were in quarantine, the positive COVID-19 people, which was leaked by Michelle Bogue for nakedly political purposes to Hamish Walker, remember him. No journalist published any of that, and that didn't involve a politician's details, so there are obviously differences, but we're still talking about private details, right?
And public interest does trump privacy in a court of law, but you have to prove that the public interest, and that's still up for debate, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. I think that the motive is really irrelevant. in most cases. If there's a public interest in releasing the information, it doesn't matter whether the person has good or bad motivations in giving you the information.
I disagree. I think it's part of the test.
Very few sources have good motivations that aren't at all self-serving.
What about whistleblowers, Ben?
Yeah, whistleblowers are often people who've
you
been
don't
poorly
think they
treated
have good
in their
intentions,
jobs.
but
you can have good intentions mixed with selfish intentions.
But that doesn't make it inherently bad.
I don't think any of them are inherently bad. I think that, leaks are the lifeblood of democracy, that it's good to have information out there in most cases. And, I don't think that motive is particularly, just like in criminal law, I don't think motive is necessarily a relevant consideration. It doesn't matter why you kill somebody. It doesn't matter why you leak personal information.
I thought establishing motive was an important part of...
No, only in TV shows. Yeah, it's not a legal test. So, but the other thing is, look, I agree. I don't think there was any public interest in well, there may have been some public interest in the fact that the guy who wanted to be Deputy Prime Minister couldn't fill out forms correctly, but I don't think the information should have been leaked. The information, the fault there came from this kind of Stasi-like network of public servants who all had the information kicked up the chain to themselves and then started sharing it amongst themselves. The current State Services Commissioner, Peter Hughes, the then head of MSD, Brendan Boyle, who were all kind of just retailing this information around basically as court gossip. They say that there was very important no surprises issues at stake, but of course there weren't. This was just them trying to curry favour and impress their ministers. At that point, as soon as it reached a political level, of course it was going to leak somehow. None of this changes the fact that I actually think there should have been much harsher repercussions on those civil servants, and they did come in for some quite oblique but clear criticism in the court case about their handling under no surprises. None of this changes the fact that Winston Peters has the right to wildly accuse people in Parliament under privilege, but he also has the right to be judged as a foolish old man, tilting at windmills, swinging wildly in a pub car park, photoshopped less as a boxer by the bad boys of Brexit meeting David Seymour in the ring, and more just sort of swinging wildly at a lamppost after he's been kicked out of the bar. So
glad we got the bad boys of Brexit. I sort of feel like we should give them a shout out every time, because you mentioned the lifeblood of democracy before, Ben, and what better symbolise the lifeblood of democracy than the bad boys of Brexit? We're just blessed to have them involved in our politics. Very quickly before we go, on Sunday, another example of the lifeblood of democracy was witnessed at the local Campbell Centre in Auckland. More than 1,000 people. Jami-Lee Ross had consciously coupled with his Advance Party, with the New Zealand Public Party, and Billy Te Kahika, who has built quite a substantial following, mostly online and mostly appealing to conspiracy theories around 5G, around anti-vax, and around the
COVID
man-made bioweapon that is COVID-19. Is this just a sideshow, Annabelle, or is there a way in which this could be like? I mean, Alex Bray, who wrote about this, who is fascinated by minor parties, reckons that there is a possibility. Maybe it might still be an outside possibility that there is a kind of groundswell happening off the radar of mainstream politics that could surprise us in the weeks to come.
There's absolutely zero chance that Billy TK is going to win Te Tai Tokerau, and frankly, Jami-Lee Ross is a sideshow. But what's interesting about Billy TK Jr. is that he is a charismatic, articulate, strong communicator who has tapped into a part of the Māori demographic who, are suspicious of actually, it's something that Alice has written about already in terms of why Māori are susceptible to
on the spinoff.co.nz.
To 5G conspiracies, and that's about people who have been screwed over by the state, essentially, who become deeply suspicious of the state's motives, and I think that he has tapped into it. I think he has a strong social media following. Is it going to translate to seats in Parliament? Absolutely not. Is it going to hurt Labour? No. If anything, he'll probably bleed what's left over of the Māori Party / Mana Party vote. So I don't think it poses a major political threat, but it's interesting. And it's something to keep an eye out on, because I think there is a growing sense of, resentment in that community.
Ben?
Yeah, I don't think it's material to this election. It is material to social cohesion and effective public health measures after the election and in our near future. Often there's been a tendency to write off anti-vax conspiracists, flat earthers, whatever, as middle-class white people with too much time on their hands who go down these internet rabbit holes. That's certainly kind of how it started. But once something is online, it's not quarantined. Middle-class manias are not quarantined to the idle, stupid rich once they're out on the internet. And they can actually have an extremely negative impact on vulnerable communities in terms of destroying trust in things like vaccination. Vaccination rates have fallen considerably in the last 5 years, coinciding pretty much with all of this conspiracism online. Obviously, with COVID, our greatest best hope for resuming something akin to a normal world is a COVID vaccine. The last thing we want is people, particularly people who live in crowded circumstances, who have large families, to be suspicious of vaccines. It's an incredibly negative development, unbelievably irresponsible of the quisling, treacherous idiot Jami-Lee Ross to align himself with this. I think it was about 2 years ago he had his massive conflagration in Parliament, and at that point he probably thought he had nothing left to lose. But in public life, there's no floor. There's just a pit that falls forever, and Jami-Lee Ross is just tumbling towards the centre of the earth.
Riding the drill into the earth's core.
Yeah, the fact that somebody like him could provide more of a platform in the media, on Radio New Zealand, in mainstream media, for lunatic ideas like this. I honestly don't know how that guy can live with himself or look at himself in the mirror.
On that upbeat note, we will wind this episode of Gone By Lunchtime up. Thank you very much to producer Jane Yee. You can subscribe to this podcast via your preferred podcast provider. You can leave us a glowing review if you like, and share the joy. Write it down on the internet, spray it on a wall. Do what you need to do. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Annabelle. I'm Toby. Bye.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spinoff. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, Podcast Manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spinoff Podcast Network.